He called me a parasite. My own father, standing there in the doorway of my childhood bedroom, with a box labelled Madison's junk in his hands, looked me dead in the eye and said it without flinching. My mother was behind him, her arms full of my old sweaters, her expression a careful, curated blankness I knew all too well. They weren't just packing up my things, they were erasing me, and the casual cruelty of it was breathtaking. I'd driven 2 hours for our regular family dinner, a tradition I clung to, a reminder of a stability that was apparently pure fiction. The silence in the car on the way over had been peaceful, but now it felt like the calm before a storm I never saw coming. Why? That was the only word that echoed in the ringing silence of the hallway. Before I continue the story, please subscribe. I need to reach 1,000 subscribers so I can keep bringing you stories like this every day. It's just one click for you, but it means a lot to me. The shock was a physical thing, a cold wave that started in my chest and spread to my fingertips, leaving them numb. For a moment, I was convinced this was some kind of bizarre, unfunny prank. My father, a man whose sense of humour was drier than the Sahara, wasn't one for jokes, but the alternative was too monstrous to comprehend. He stood there, blocking the entrance to my room, a space that had been my sanctuary for 18 years. It was painted a soft lavender, a colour I had picked out myself when I was 12, a project my dad had grumbled about but ultimately helped me with. Now, the walls were bare, with spackled patches marking where my posters and pictures used to hang. It was a ghost of a room, and they were the unwelcome exorcists. "What are you doing?" I finally managed to ask, my voice a thready whisper that felt foreign in my own throat. My father shifted the box in his hands, the cardboard groaning under the weight of my discarded memories. "It's time for you to stand on your own 2 feet, Madison," he said, his tone dripping with a condescending paternalism that made my skin crawl. It was the voice he used when I was a teenager and had missed my curfew, not the voice you use when you're evicting your own daughter without notice. My mother remained silent, her gaze fixed on a point just over my shoulder, a master of strategic avoidance. She was an enabler, a silent co-conspirator in my father's quiet tyranny, and her passivity was, in many ways, more hurtful than his overt aggression. It was a performance I had seen my whole life, but never had the stakes been this high. They were a united front, a wall of parental authority I was suddenly on the wrong side of. The air was thick with unspoken words, years of simmering resentments I was apparently oblivious to. I looked past them, into the room, and saw my life being systematically dismantled. My books were gone from the shelves, my debate trophies were missing from the mantel, the worn teddy bear I'd had since I was 3 was peeking out from the top of a trash bag. They weren't just packing my stuff, they were curating my exit, deciding what was worth saving and what was disposable. The message was clear. My presence in this house, in their lives, was no longer required. It was a betrayal so profound, it felt like a physical blow. And the worst part was, I had absolutely no idea why it was happening. This wasn't a decision. It was a verdict, delivered without a trial. The drive home, or rather, the drive back to my small apartment 2 hours away, was a blur of tears and frantic, unanswered questions. My phone sat silent on the passenger seat, a stark reminder of the calls my parents were pointedly ignoring. Every few minutes, I'd glance at it, a fresh wave of hope cresting and then crashing as the screen remained dark. It felt like I was grieving a death, the sudden and violent death of the relationship I thought I had with them. My mind raced, replaying every conversation, every interaction from the past few months, searching for a clue, a hint of the cataclysm to come. Had I said something wrong during our last dinner? Did I forget a birthday or an anniversary? My brain offered up 100 possibilities, each more flimsy and desperate than the last. The truth was, there was nothing. Our relationship had been, from my perspective, stable, predictable, even. We had our weekly dinners, our holiday traditions, the comfortable rhythm of a family that had weathered the usual storms. Or so I believed. Now, I saw that my perception was a carefully constructed illusion. I had been living in a play, and my co-stars had just walked off stage, leaving me alone under the spotlight. The term my father had used, parasite, echoed in my head, a venomous word that sunk its fangs deeper with each repetition. It implied I was a leech, a freeloader, someone who took without giving. But I had been financially independent since I graduated from college 3 years ago. I had a good job as a graphic designer. I paid my own bills. I never asked them for a dime. In fact, I often brought them expensive gifts, took them out to dinner, and even helped my dad set up his new consulting website for free, a project that had consumed weeks of my evenings and weekends. The accusation wasn't just baseless. It was a deliberate, calculated insult, designed to inflict maximum pain. It was intended to rewrite our history, to paint me as a burden they were heroically shedding. The cruelty of it was breathtaking. By the time I stumbled into my apartment, the sun was setting, casting long, lonely shadows across my living room. I collapsed onto my couch, the silence of my empty apartment, a stark contrast to the chaos in my mind. The emotional anchor in my life had always been my family, and now that anchor had been ripped away, leaving me adrift in a sea of confusion and hurt. I felt a profound sense of isolation, the kind that comes from realizing the people you trusted most in the world are capable of unimaginable betrayal. My best friend Chloe was my first and only call. She was the emotional anchor I desperately needed, the one person I knew would believe me without question. When she picked up on the second ring, I couldn't even get the words out. All that came out was a strangled sob. She didn't press, she just waited, her calm presence a soothing balm on my frayed nerves. After I finally managed to choke out the story, her reaction was a mirror of my own disbelief, quickly followed by a righteous fury that was fiercely protective. "They did what?" she had shrieked, her voice a mix of shock and outrage. "That's not just unfair, Madison. That's cruel." Hearing her validate my feelings, confirming that I wasn't overreacting or being too sensitive, was like a life raft in a stormy sea. In the days that followed, my parents maintained their stony silence. My calls went to voicemail. My texts were left unread. It was a psychological torment, a deliberate withholding of information, that left me in a state of suspended agony. The not knowing was the worst part. I would have preferred a screaming match, a list of grievances, anything over this suffocating void. During that time, Chloe was my lifeline. She came over with takeout and trashy movies, letting me cry and vent and rage. She helped me dissect every memory, every conversation, searching for the phantom offense that had led to this. We were like detectives investigating a crime with no evidence and no motive. Was it about my career? My father had always been quietly dismissive of my choice to pursue art instead of a more prestigious field like law or medicine. Was it about my boyfriend, Liam, whom they had met only a handful of times and seemed polite, if not overly enthusiastic about? Or was it something deeper, a resentment that had been festering for years, completely hidden from my view? My mind kept flashing back to my father's face, the cold, hard set of his jaw, and the word parasite. It was a word chosen for its power to wound, to diminish. A parasite is an organism that lives in or on another organism and benefits by deriving nutrients at the other's expense. The implication was clear. I was draining them, taking from them, offering nothing of value in return. It was a narrative so divorced from reality that it had to be a projection, a story they had told themselves to justify their actions. But why? What could possibly motivate two parents to spontaneously and brutally sever ties with their only child? The question haunted my every waking moment. The first clue arrived, not in a phone call or a text, but in a plain manila envelope that appeared in my mailbox a week after the incident. There was no return address, but the spidery, elegant handwriting was unmistakably my mother's. My heart hammered against my ribs as I tore it open, a desperate hope warring with a cold dread. Inside was not a letter of explanation or apology, but a check for $5,000. The memo line was blank. There was no note, no card, just the check, cold and impersonal. It felt like a payoff, a severance package for a daughter they had unceremoniously fired. The insult was so profound, so deeply wounding, that I almost laughed. They thought they could buy my silence, my compliance, with a check. They thought my love and my pain had a price tag. This wasn't an olive branch. It was a declaration of war. It was the smoking gun reveal that confirmed this wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a deliberate, calculated act of emotional and financial warfare. The check galvanized me. The hurt and confusion that had paralyzed me for a week began to morph into a cold, hard anger. The victim in me was receding, and in her place, a strategist was emerging. They wanted to treat me like a business transaction. Fine. I would be the most ruthless CEO they had ever encountered. The patient genius within me, the part of me that had always been underestimated, began to wake up. I had spent my life being the good daughter, the peacemaker, the one who smoothed over my father's moods and catered to my mother's anxieties. I had swallowed my own needs, my own opinions, to maintain the fragile peace of our family, that Madison was gone. She had died in that lavender-walled room, surrounded by the ghosts of a happy childhood. The woman who was left was someone they had never met, and she was about to turn the tables on them with a calm resolve they could not possibly anticipate. I took a picture of the check and sent it to Chloe with a single message: game on. Then, I put the check in a drawer. I wasn't going to cash it. It was evidence. And I was building a case. Part 5. The second clue was more subtle, and it came from an unlikely source. My Aunt Carol, my mother's younger sister. She and my mum had a strained relationship, a rivalry that had simmered for decades, but they maintained a facade of civility for the sake of family harmony. Carol called me 2 weeks after the incident, her voice laced with a syrupy, feigned concern that immediately put me on high alert. "Madison, darling, I heard what happened," she began, her tone suggesting she was privy to some secret information. "Your mother is just beside herself with worry." I knew this was a lie. My mother wasn't worried. She was hiding. Carol was fishing, trying to get my side of the story to use as ammunition in her ongoing Cold War with her sister. I played along, offering vague, non-committal answers, letting her fill the silence with her own assumptions and gossip. And then, she dropped the bombshell. "I just can't believe your parents would do this, especially after all the money you've given them." I froze. "What money?" I asked, my voice dangerously calm. Carol backtracked immediately, realizing her mistake. "Oh, just helping out here and there. Your mother mentioned it once, a while ago. But the seed was planted. My parents had been telling people I was giving them money. Why? To what end?" It was a piece of the puzzle that didn't fit, a thread that I knew would unravel the entire tapestry of their lies if I pulled on it hard enough. After the call, I went into full detective mode. I started with my own bank records, meticulously combing through years of statements. I hadn't given them large sums of money, but I had been generous. There were the plane tickets for their anniversary trip to Hawaii, the new dishwasher when theirs broke, the constant stream of smaller gifts and dinners. When I added it all up, the total was substantial, far more than I had realized. But it was all framed as gifts, tokens of my affection. They had never asked for help, and I had never offered it in a way that could be construed as a loan. So why would they be telling people I was supporting them? The only logical answer was that they were building a narrative, a story they were telling to their friends and family, a story that painted them as martyrs, sacrificing for their ungrateful, parasitic daughter. A story that would justify their eventual, brutal eviction of me. It was a level of premeditation that was chilling. They hadn't just woken up one day and decided to kick me out. This had been planned, for months, maybe even years. They were the architects of my downfall, and I had been blissfully unaware of the demolition they were plotting. The anger that had been simmering inside me now had a focus. I wasn't just fighting for my own dignity anymore. I was fighting to expose the truth, to tear down the facade of their perfect family and show everyone the condescending fools they really were. The next step was to understand the why. The check and Aunt Carol's slip-up were the what, but the motive remained elusive. I started thinking about my parents' financial situation. Outwardly, they were comfortable. My father had taken an early retirement from his engineering job, and my mother had never worked outside the home. They lived in the same spacious house I grew up in an affluent suburb. They took nice vacations, drove new cars, and were members of the local country club. But I also knew my father had a gambling problem. It was the family's dark secret, the monster in the closet that everyone pretended wasn't there. He played the stock market with a reckless abandon that was more akin to a high-stakes poker game than a sound investment strategy. There had been a few big wins over the years, which he boasted about endlessly. But I knew there had been losses too, whispered arguments behind closed doors that would abruptly stop the moment I entered a room. Had he suffered a catastrophic loss? Was that why they needed money? But if that was the case, why wouldn't they just ask me for help? I would have given it without hesitation. The answer, I realized, was pride. My father was an arrogant, prideful man, and to admit to his daughter that he had gambled away his retirement would be a blow to his ego he couldn't handle. It was easier to invent a narrative where I was the villain, the parasite, the ungrateful child who needed to be cut off for her own good. It was a way for him to maintain his sense of superiority, even in the face of his own spectacular failure. This realization was both horrifying and liberating. Horrifying because it revealed the depths of my father's narcissism, and liberating because it gave me a motive. It was all about the money. My parents weren't just cruel, they were desperate. And desperation makes people do ugly, predictable things. With this newfound understanding, I started to formulate a plan. A righteous turnaround was in order. I wasn't going to confront them directly. That would give them the satisfaction of a fight, a chance to play the victim and gaslight me. No, my revenge would be strategic, surgical, and utterly devastating. I would use their own weapons against them: deception, manipulation, and the quiet, insidious power of public opinion. I was going to take their carefully constructed narrative and shred it to pieces, and I was going to do it with a calm, cold resolve that would leave them reeling. The patient genius was about to go to work. My plan had 2 phases. Phase 1 was information gathering. Phase 2 was execution. For Phase 1, I needed an ally on the inside, someone who could be my eyes and ears. That ally was Liam, my boyfriend. He was a software engineer with a quiet intensity and a fierce loyalty that I had, until now, probably taken for granted. When I laid out the whole sordid story for him, including my suspicions about my father's gambling, he didn't just offer a shoulder to cry on. He offered his skills. "I can build you a website," he said, his eyes gleaming with a protective fire. "A place where you can tell your story, in your own words. We can post the picture of the check, the bank statements, everything." The idea was brilliant. A website would be my digital smoking gun, a centralized location for all the evidence I was collecting. It would allow me to control the narrative, to bypass the gossip and innuendo of my parents' smear campaign and present the unvarnished truth. We spent the next week building it. Liam handled the technical side, while I wrote the text, carefully crafting my story to be both emotionally compelling and factually irrefutable. I wrote about my childhood, the love, security I thought I had, the shock and pain of the eviction, the insulting check, and my dawning realization about my father's gambling. I wrote it all in a raw, personal tone, a first-person confessional that would allow readers to connect with my experience on a human level. It was a painful process, reliving the betrayal with every word I typed, but it was also cathartic. With each sentence, I felt my power growing, my voice getting stronger. I was no longer the victim. I was the author of my own vindication. We decided to keep the website private for now, a secret weapon to be deployed at the perfect moment. But its mere existence was a comfort, a tangible representation of the justice I was determined to achieve. It was a promise to myself that I would not be silenced, that the truth would come out, and that my parents would be held accountable for their actions. The stage was being set for the final act, and I was no longer an unwilling participant. I was the director. While Liam was building the website, I focused on gathering more concrete evidence of my father's financial troubles. This was the trickiest part of the plan, as I had no legal access to their financial records. I had to rely on indirect methods, on piecing together clues from various sources. I started with public records. A quick search of county court records revealed that my father had been sued by a credit card company 2 years ago for an unpaid balance of over $20,000. The case had been settled out of court, but the record was there, a black and white testament to his financial irresponsibility. Next, I reached out to my cousin, Mark, my father's nephew. Mark worked at a luxury car dealership, and I remembered my dad bragging about the new convertible he had bought from him last year. I called Mark under the pretext of looking for a new car for myself, and casually brought up my dad's purchase. "He paid cash for it, right?" I asked, feigning admiration. Mark laughed. "Your dad? No way. He financed the whole thing. The bank barely approved him, to be honest. His credit is a mess." Another piece of the puzzle clicked into place. My parents were living a lie, maintaining the illusion of wealth while drowning in debt. The new car, the country club membership, the lavish vacations, it was all a house of cards, built on a foundation of loans and credit. And I had been unwittingly propping it up with my gifts, which they had then used as proof of their financial stability to secure more loans. The irony was so dark, it was almost humorous. The parasite wasn't me. It was my father's gambling addiction, an insatiable beast that was consuming their lives from the inside out. They had projected their own financial parasitism onto me, their only child, because facing the truth of their own situation was too shameful. The final piece of evidence came from a surprisingly low-tech source, the mail. My parents were still using my childhood home as their mailing address for some of their accounts, a detail I had forgotten until a stray piece of mail from my mother was forwarded to my apartment. It was a statement from a high-end department store, and out of a morbid curiosity, I opened it. The balance was staggering, tens of thousands of dollars on clothes, jewelry, and spa treatments. My mother, the silent, long-suffering wife, was just as complicit as my father, numbing her own anxieties with a shopping addiction she couldn't afford. They were two sides of the same self-destructive coin, locked in a codependent dance of denial and deceit. I now had everything I needed. The website was ready, the evidence was compiled, and the narrative was clear. It was time for Phase 2. It was time to burn their house of cards to the ground. The opportunity to launch Phase 2 presented itself in the form of an invitation. My grandparents, my father's parents, were celebrating their 50th wedding anniversary with a huge party at the very same country club my parents were struggling to afford. The entire extended family would be there, a captive audience for the drama that was about to unfold. My parents, of course, would be the guests of honor, the proud son and his devoted wife, basking in the glow of their parents' milestone. The irony was almost too perfect. They had tried to erase me from their lives, but they couldn't erase me from the family. My grandmother had called me personally to invite me, her voice warm and loving, completely unaware of the schism that had torn our family apart. It was clear my parents hadn't told them what they had done. They were trying to control the narrative by siloing their lies, telling one story to their friends and another to their family. This party was my chance to merge those two narratives, to force the truth into the light. I RSVP'd yes, my voice a model of cheerful anticipation. Then, I set my plan in motion. The night before the party, I made the website live. I sent the link to a carefully curated list of people, to my Aunt Carol, with a note that said, "I think you'll find this interesting." To my cousin Mark, with a thank you for his help. To a few of my parents' close friends, the ones who had been the most vocal in their concern for me. And finally, I sent it to my parents, with a simple, chilling message. The truth has a way of coming out. Then I turned off my phone. I didn't want to hear their frantic calls, their empty threats, their desperate attempts at damage control. I wanted them to stew in the silence, to imagine the digital wildfire that was spreading through their carefully curated world. I wanted them to walk into that anniversary party, knowing that everyone in that room had seen their lies, their hypocrisy, their cruelty. The next day, I got ready for the party with a sense of calm I hadn't felt in months. I chose my outfit carefully. A simple, elegant black dress that was both a sign of mourning for the family I had lost and a statement of my own quiet power. I did my hair and makeup with a meticulous attention to detail, not to impress anyone, but to fortify myself for the battle ahead. As I drove to the country club, I felt a sense of righteous empowerment. I was no longer the victim of their story. I was the author of my own, and tonight I was going to read it aloud for everyone to hear. Walking into that party was like stepping into a silent movie. The moment I entered the room, a hush fell over the crowd. Every eye was on me, a mixture of pity, curiosity, and morbid fascination. I could see them gathered in small clumps, whispering behind their hands, their faces a mixture of shock and scandal. The website had done its work. The digital wildfire had spread faster and more effectively than I could have ever imagined. I saw my Aunt Carol in a corner, holding her phone, her face a mask of vindicated glee. She had been waiting for this moment for years, and I had just handed it to her on a silver platter. My cousin Mark gave me a subtle nod from across the room, a gesture of solidarity that I returned with a small, grateful smile. And then I saw them, my parents. They were standing by the bar, their backs to the room, but I could see the tension in their shoulders, the rigid set of their bodies. They were isolated, shunned, the radioactive centre of a social fallout of their own making. My mother was clutching a glass of white wine, so tightly her knuckles were white. My father was staring at his phone, his face pale, his expression a mixture of fury and panic. For a moment, I felt a flicker of pity. They looked so small, so pathetic, so utterly defeated. But then I remembered the coldness in my father's eyes as he called me a parasite, the calculated cruelty of the check, the years of quiet manipulation and emotional neglect. And the pity vanished, replaced by a cold, hard resolve. I made my way through the room, my head held high, ignoring the whispers and the stares. I walked straight to my grandparents, who were sitting at a table near the front, their faces etched with confusion and worry. My grandmother's eyes filled with tears as she saw me. "Madison, what is going on?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Your father, your mother, they won't talk to us." I took her hand. "I think you should look at this," I said, and I showed her the website on my phone. As she scrolled through it, her expression shifted from confusion to horror, and then to a deep, profound sadness. My grandfather read it over her shoulder, his face growing darker with every word. When they were finished, they looked at me, their eyes full of a pain that mirrored my own. And then they looked at their son, my father, with a look of such utter disappointment. It was more devastating than any anger could ever be. The condescending fool had finally been exposed, not by me, but by the truth, and his downfall was just beginning. The confrontation, when it finally happened, was not the screaming match I had anticipated. It was something far more satisfying. My father, seeing me with his parents, finally seemed to realize that his carefully constructed world was collapsing around him. He stormed over to our table, his face a mottled red, his voice a low, threatening growl. "What have you done?" he hissed, his eyes darting around the room, seeing the judgment in every face. My mother trailed behind him, a pale, silent ghost, her eyes wide with a desperate, pleading look. She was hoping I would fix this, that I would somehow make it all go away. But the Madison who fixed things was gone. I remained seated, looking up at him with a calm that seemed to unnerve him more than any shouting would have. "I told the truth," I said, my voice clear and steady. "Something you seem to have forgotten how to do." My grandfather, a man of few words but immense presence, stood up. He was shorter than my father, but at that moment he seemed to tower over him. "Is it true, David?" he asked, his voice shaking with a quiet rage. "Did you do this to your daughter? Did you lie to us?" My father sputtered, trying to formulate a response, but the words wouldn't come. He was so used to being in control, to being the one who dictated the narrative, that he was utterly unprepared for this. He was a bully who had just been punched in the mouth, and he didn't know how to react. "She's exaggerating," he finally managed to say, his voice lacking any conviction. "She's always been dramatic." It was a weak, pathetic defense, and everyone in that room knew it. The evidence was irrefutable. The narrative I had woven was too tight, too detailed, to be dismissed as mere drama. My grandmother, who had been silent up to this point, spoke up, her voice dripping with an icy disappointment that was far more cutting than any anger. "We are ashamed of you," she said, her words a death knell to my father's pride. "To do this to your own child, it's unforgivable." My father looked at his mother, his face a mask of disbelief. He had expected her to take his side, to defend him, to help him smooth this over. But he had underestimated the power of the truth, and the depth of a grandparent's love. Defeated, he turned and walked away, my mother scurrying after him like a frightened mouse. They didn't just leave the party. They fled, a public and humiliating retreat that was a far more fitting punishment than any private confrontation could have been. The justice was poetic, the schadenfreude was delicious, and the sense of vindication was absolute. In the aftermath of the party, the fallout was swift and brutal. My parents had become social pariahs. Their friends, who had been so quick to offer me their sympathy and concern, now avoided them like the plague. They were uninvited from dinner parties, their calls went unanswered, and their presence at the country club was met with stony silence and pointed glares. The community they had worked so hard to impress had turned on them, and they were left with nothing but the shambles of their reputation. My Aunt Carol, true to form, revelled in their downfall, providing me with regular updates on their social demise. "Your mother tried to join our book club," she told me, her voice giddy with schadenfreude. The awkward silence was so loud, you could have heard a pin drop. While a part of me felt a grim satisfaction at their social ostracization, my primary emotion was a sense of relief. The war was over, and I had won. But it was a victory that felt hollow in some ways. I had exposed their lies. I had achieved a measure of justice, but I had also lost my family. The sense of empowerment was real, but so was the grief. My grandparents, however, were my saving grace. They embraced me with a fierce, protective love that filled the void my parents had left. They insisted I move into their guest house for a while, a quiet, peaceful cottage on their property that felt like a sanctuary. They listened to me for hours, letting me process the pain and anger, their unwavering support a balm to my wounded soul. They were the emotional anchors I had been missing, the true patriarch and matriarch of a family that was slowly, painfully, starting to heal. One evening, my grandfather came to me with a checkbook. "I want to repay you," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "for everything your father took from you." I refused, of course. This was never about the money. It was about the truth. "But there is one thing you can do for me," I said. "I want you to help me set up a foundation." The idea had been percolating in my mind for a while, a way to turn my pain into something positive. I wanted to create a fund for young people who had been financially or emotionally abandoned by their families, a resource to help them get back on their feet. My grandfather's eyes lit up. He was a retired accountant, and the idea of a project, a cause to champion, appealed to him. "I think that's a wonderful idea," he said. And just like that, the Madison Foundation was born, a testament to the resilience of the human spirit and a symbol of my own transformation from victim to victor. The foundation became my focus, my passion, my purpose. It was a way to channel my anger and my grief into something constructive, something that would help others who had gone through similar experiences. My grandfather and I spent weeks working on the logistics, filing the paperwork, and building a website with Liam's expert help, of course. The mission of the foundation was simple: to provide emergency grants and mentorship to young adults who had been cut off from their families. We wanted to offer them the support that I had been so fortunate to have, to let them know that they were not alone. The response was overwhelming. We launched the foundation with a small seed fund from my grandparents and a personal donation from me. I finally cashed that $5,000 check and gave every penny to the foundation, a final, symbolic act of defiance. I wrote a blog post for the foundation's website, telling my story in detail, and it went viral. My personal tragedy had become a public cause, and people from all over the world reached out to share their own stories of family estrangement and to offer their support. Donations poured in, from small, individual contributions to large corporate grants. It was a powerful reminder that while my own family had failed me, there was a larger, more compassionate community that was willing to step up and fill the void. The foundation was more than just a charity. It was a movement. It was a statement that family is not just about blood. It's about love, support, and acceptance. And for those who are denied those things by their own relatives, there is a chosen family waiting to embrace them. The work was challenging, but it was also incredibly rewarding. Every time we were able to help a young person escape a toxic environment, or pay for their tuition, or simply provide them with a listening ear, I felt a sense of healing, a sense of peace. My pain had been transformed into a source of strength, not just for me, but for others. The righteous turnaround was complete, and the resolution was more profound and more meaningful than I could have ever imagined. About a year after the incident, I received a letter. It was from my mother. Her spidery, elegant handwriting was shakier than I remembered, the words on the page stained with what I assumed were tears. It was a long, rambling letter, a confession, and an apology all in one. She told me everything, about my father's gambling addiction, which was far worse than I had imagined, about the mountain of debt they were in, about the shame and the fear that had consumed them. She admitted that the parasite narrative had been a lie, a desperate, pathetic attempt to justify their actions and to shift the blame for their own failures onto me. She told me that my father was in therapy, that he was finally trying to confront his demons, but that she didn't know if their marriage would survive, and then she begged for my forgiveness. "I know I don't deserve it," she wrote, "but I am so sorry, Madison. I was a coward, and I will regret it for the rest of my life." The letter was a raw, unfiltered look into the heart of her own personal hell, and for the first time in a long time, I felt a flicker of empathy for her. She was a victim too, in a way, a prisoner of my father's addiction and her own weakness. But empathy is not the same as forgiveness. I wrote her back a short, simple note. "I have received your letter," I wrote. "I am glad you are getting help. I wish you peace." It was not the absolution she was looking for, but it was the truth. I had found my own peace, but it was a peace that did not include her, or my father. The bond of trust had been so thoroughly broken, it was irreparable. I had moved on. I had built a new life, a new family, a new purpose. And while I would always carry the scars of their betrayal, I would not let them define me. My future was my own, and it was bright, and it was free of the toxic dynamic that had defined my past. Life settled into a new, peaceful rhythm. The foundation thrived, becoming a nationally recognized organization. Liam and I moved in together, our relationship strengthened by the trials we had faced. My bond with my grandparents deepened, and they became the loving, supportive parental figures I had always craved. I was happy, truly happy, in a way I had never been before. One day, I was giving a speech at a fundraising gala for the foundation. I was telling my story, as I had done so many times before, but this time, something was different. As I looked out at the sea of faces, I saw a man standing in the back of the room. He was older, thinner than I remembered, with greying hair and a haunted look in his eyes. It was my father. Our eyes met, and for a long moment, the world seemed to stop. I saw a flicker of something in his expression, a mixture of shame, regret, and a desperate, yearning sadness. I didn't falter. I didn't stop my speech. I simply held his gaze for a moment longer, a silent acknowledgement of the chasm that lay between us. And then I looked away, back at the warm, supportive faces in the crowd, and I continued with my story. It was a symbolic action, a final, definitive closing of a painful chapter in my life. He was a ghost from a past I had survived, a reminder of the person I used to be. But he had no power over me anymore. After the speech, he was gone. He didn't try to approach me. He didn't try to talk to me. It was a silent, unilateral surrender, an admission of his defeat, and in that moment, I knew that I was truly free. The journey from the betrayed daughter to the empowered philanthropist had been a long and arduous one, a trial by fire that had forged me into a stronger, more resilient person. I had learned that true strength isn't about the absence of pain, but about what you do with it. It's about turning your wounds into wisdom, your anger into action, your personal tragedy into a public triumph. My story had become a source of inspiration for others, a testament to the power of one person to stand up against injustice and to create their own happy ending. The irony was not lost on me that my parents' attempt to destroy me had been the very thing that had allowed me to find my true self, my true purpose. In their arrogance and their cruelty, they had inadvertently given me the greatest gift of all, the freedom to define my own life, on my own terms. The dialogue of my life had changed. The hesitant, people-pleasing girl had been replaced by a strong, assertive woman who was not afraid to speak her mind, to fight for what she believed in, and to demand the respect she deserved. The emotional tone of my life had shifted from betrayal and isolation to justice and empowerment. It was a transformation that was as profound as it was unexpected, a testament to the indomitable nature of the human spirit. And as I looked towards the future, I did so with a sense of optimism and a deep, abiding peace. The storm had passed, and I had emerged not just unscathed, but reborn. The foundation continued to grow, and so did I. I became a sought-after public speaker, sharing my story and my message of hope with a wider audience. I wrote a book, a memoir that chronicled my journey from heartbreak to healing, and it became a bestseller. The media dubbed me the patient genius, a moniker that I secretly enjoyed, a nod to the quiet, strategic battle I had waged and won. But for all the public accolades, my greatest satisfaction came from the quiet, personal moments. The thank you letters from the young people we had helped. The tearful hugs from the parents who had been reconciled with their estranged children after reading my book. The quiet evenings at home with Liam, building a life together based on trust, respect, and unconditional love. My relationship with my grandparents remained the bedrock of my life. We had Sunday dinners together, just the three of us. A new, healthier tradition that replaced the fraught, obligatory meals of my past. They were my biggest cheerleaders, my wisest counselors, and my most cherished friends. They were my family, in the truest sense of the word, and in their love, I found the healing that had eluded me for so long. I rarely thought about my parents anymore. They were a distant memory, a faded photograph from a life that no longer felt like my own. I heard through the grapevine that they had sold the house I grew up in, and moved to a small, unassuming condo in a different state. They had lost everything: their home, their reputation, their friends, and their daughter. It was a steep price to pay for their pride and their deceit, a tragic ending to a story of their own making. I never reached out to them, and they never reached out to me. The silence between us was a vast, unbridgeable ocean, and I had no desire to cross it. I had forgiven them, not for their sake, but for my own. I had let go of the anger and the resentment, not because they deserved it, but because I deserved to be free. The final symbolic action of my healing journey was a quiet, personal one. I went back to my childhood neighborhood one last time. I stood across the street from my old house, the new family's car in the driveway, a child's bicycle on the lawn. The lavender-walled room was now painted a cheerful yellow. I felt a pang of nostalgia, a ghost of a sadness for the little girl who had once lived there, so full of love and trust, so blissfully unaware of the betrayal to come. But it was a fleeting emotion, replaced by a sense of gratitude. Gratitude for the journey, for the lessons learned, for the strength I had discovered within myself. I took a deep breath, and then I turned and walked away, not looking back. It was time to go home, to my real home, the one I had built for myself. A home filled with love, laughter, and a hard-won peace. Years passed. The foundation became a global force for good, with chapters in a dozen countries. Liam and I got married in my grandparents' backyard, a small, intimate ceremony surrounded by our chosen family. My grandfather walked me down the aisle, his eyes shining with pride. My grandmother officiated, her voice full of a wisdom and a love that brought tears to everyone's eyes. It was a perfect day, a celebration of love, resilience, and the enduring power of the human heart. We had 2 children, a boy and a girl, and I raised them with a fierce, protective love, determined to give them the one thing I had been denied, a childhood free of manipulation, a home where they would always feel safe, seen, and unconditionally loved. I told them my story, not to burden them with my pain, but to teach them about the importance of honesty, integrity, and compassion. I wanted them to know that family is a verb, an action, a choice you make every day. It's about showing up, being present, and loving each other, not just when it's easy, but when it's hard. One day, when I was old and grey, my granddaughter asked me about my parents. We were sitting on the porch of my house, the same house where Liam and I had built our life together, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink. "Were you sad that you never saw them again?" she asked, her young face full of a sincere, innocent curiosity. I thought for a moment, searching for the right words, the honest words. "I was sad for the family I thought I had," I said, "but I was not sad for the family I lost, because in losing them, I found myself. And I found all of you." I looked at her bright, intelligent eyes, at the love that shone from her face, and I felt a sense of peace so profound, it was almost overwhelming. The righteous turnaround had not just been about justice, it had been about transformation. It had been about taking the broken pieces of my past and building a beautiful, meaningful future. And as I sat there, surrounded by the love of my family, I knew that I had everything I had ever wanted, and everything I would ever need. The vindication was not in their downfall, but in my own quiet, joyful, and deeply fulfilling life. The emotional payoff was complete.